My name is Rob Hunter. I'm the Executive Director of Frog Hollow, and I wanted to thank you all for coming out tonight. I think it's going to be an amazing presentation. One of the things I wanted to also take a moment and thank are all the people who made this possible. We've got a list of individuals. Aside from Robert and Chris, we also have sponsors for this event. We have VPR who have been lending support, raising awareness about the show. We have Outdoor Gear Exchange who have provided us with just allowing us to use this space. We have RETN, which you'll notice there's a couple cameras around. RETN has done a great job in documenting a lot of what we're doing. And this is, actually, we have one camera that will be at all of our events. This is actually a testing ground for a lot of these people who are learning the film process. In addition to our corporate type sponsors, we have a private sponsor, Fulton Gregg, who was an amazing supporter of this show, and I just wanted to acknowledge him. Shows like this don't just happen, they happen because the community comes together, because we have people who come out and become members of our organization. And so I just would also encourage all of you to consider the idea of becoming a member of Frog Hollow if you're not already. With that said, I want to introduce Robert Compton. I'm sure, my guess is most of you already know him. Amazing potter. It's an amazing show, this 40-year retrospective that we're hosting here. And I just going to turn it over to you. I would say at the end we'll probably have some questions. I'm going to have this microphone, and I'll probably point it in your direction. I'll try not to get in your face. We're trying to document this so that we can actually make this available to other people beyond this night. So I hope you don't mind, and I hope that you don't become shy because of this, and I'll try and be as discreet as possible.
And just for that said, if anybody during what I'm talking about wants to ask, so I can expand upon it, just point to Rob and he'll bring it over. And
yeah, and it doesn't have to be that close. I'm actually holding it way too close right now. So anyway, thanks a lot, and here's Robert Compton.
Cool, thank you. Well, when Rob asked me to, we talked about doing this retrospective, which was a real hoot, and boy, digging through 40 years worth of stuff is a mind-bending experience. When we decided to do workshop or do talks, I kind of broke it into 3 different ones. This one's sort of on a bit about the American Craft Council movement, if you're not real familiar with how that whole thing worked out. A brief thing on what I've done over the past 40 years, and sort of how and why my work has changed. The next talk I'm going to do is really more directed toward potters. It's about technique, what I've done, how things I made, why I made them, and a whole bunch more, which maybe nobody cares about, but more about marketing. How do you make a living at this? Because that's becoming the harder and harder thing over the years to do, and that's what the next talk's going to be. And the third one is going to be just about kilns. I'm a kiln lover. I mean, I build kilns. I've got a bunch at my studio, but I've also documented kilns from England, Wales, Ireland, New Zealand, Australia, Wales. Any place we've traveled to, we've tried to document kilns. I just find them fascinating objects. So the last workshop will be just totally focused on kilns and kiln building and why they were made the way they were and why they aren't being used the way they used to be. So with that said, this one's on a potter's life. And the idea of the American crafts movement, really, I come out of the 60s hippie era. I was after World War II, there was kind of a law, and then in the 60s, the rebellion, and all of us who were over 60 kind of remember all the things that were going on, Martin Luther King and JFK, and all the things that kind of changed our lives. And a number of us kind of chose an alternate lifestyle, and that's really sort of how I've got into the whole process. The early craft movements, again, I'm trying to give you guys a little bit of history for Vermont. I'm not going to talk nationwide about Volkus and Soldner and all these big names you see in magazines. I'll talk a little bit more about Vermont. But in the early 1950s and 60s, there's a magazine called Ceramics Monthly, and anybody who's a potter knows about Ceramics Monthly. But if you've ever picked up a copy of Ceramics Monthly from like 1953, it is a hoot, because it's basically talking about casting doll heads and how to make an angel out of 2 pieces of cast clay. It has nothing to do with making objects. It was all about slip casting. and that all kind of changed with the decades. So the focus really for clay, Ceramics Monthly, and in this area, anybody remember Miller Ceramics? No, okay. He was a big clay supplier up here in Vermont in the late 50s and early 60s. And he used to run around with 3 tanker trailers, like these big milk tanker trailers with liquid slip in them. And he would drop off liquid slip at all the little Dot Ceramic shops. They used to be all over the state. You know, every little town had a Dot Ceramics or a J Ceramics where you could go in and you could cast a little Jesus or some figure and then paint it yourself. But that was all done with liquid clay, and that's what Carl Miller sort of did his business around. He eventually changed over to doing paste clay. But at the same time, there were some people that nobody ever heard of, and I'd like to just acknowledge them. Jack Kennedy, not the Jack Kennedy that we're all sort of descendants of, Kennedy brothers down in Virgins. Jack had a pottery in Bristol in the late 1940s, and he was doing some early slipware. Frank Mann, who again probably nobody's ever heard of, but he was a well-known potter in Shelburne. Again, kind of died 25 years ago, so not so awfully well known. And Frank Goss, who had a business called Onion River Pottery. Again, nobody kind of remembers them, but these were sort of the people just a generation ahead of when I sort of got into clay. In the 1960s and the 1970s, Ceramics Monthly started to focus more on studio potters, and what we think of today as people making pots on the wheel. And the focus of their magazine changed a great deal. And the early people from that era, I started making pots in 1969, but George Gatchard, who's got a lamp business out on Route 15 in Cambridge. Cambridge or Underhill? Yeah, well anyway, he sold it now. He sold it to a guy in Hyde Park. But anyway, George was my mentor. He was my first potter. Bob Burnell, who ran Stone Soldier Pottery in southern Vermont. David Gill, who probably you would have known, but he started Bennington Pottery. And that was sort of that next generation of potters from the 60s era. And we're getting into my era now. So in the 1960s, 1970s, the kind of craft movement really kind of took off, and I was part of that whole era. There was a real proliferation of potters then. It seems like the pot shop at UVM was just always packed. I mean, everybody wanted to be a potter, and nobody thought about how they're going to make a living at it, but everybody wanted to be a potter, and we all supported each other in that crazy venture. And it was all, again, related to like an alternative lifestyle, the social crisis that was going on with Vietnam and everything else. And the results were that there was a whole bunch of people who became potters. Joe Fortin, who ran Crow Hill Pottery, David Blanchard, Lucinda Rochester. These are all people who came out of the late 60s, early 70s, who did pots for about 10 years and then found out that they needed more to live on and kind of focused on other things. There's sort of only a handful that sort of are still kicking and crawling their way through the mud world that I'm part of now. So I just wanted to do a real wrap up on the whole crafts movement thing. It's really different now in the crafts movement. Hey, between 2012 and 1972, that 40-year period was just, it couldn't be much different. I mean, things like healthcare today and shipping and expenses of things just make it a lot harder to make a living as a studio potter, as a one-man studio potter producing work and then trying to sell it in the current marketplace. I've given workshops in Wales and Australia, New Zealand, and England, and I oftentimes talk to the potter groups there, and they're usually potters clubs, so where you have half the people are really making a living at it, the other half are hobby potters who are serious about it. And I would tell them that the first $20,000 worth of pots I sell in a year pays for my health insurance, because I have to sell $20,000 worth of pots to net the 12 that it costs me to pay for health insurance. And they're going, we make a good living as potters here on $20,000 worth of sales. So that this thing I often heard, Chris and I often heard, was, you Americans work way too hard. And I'm going, you got to understand, there's a reason for it. It's not like we just want to work hard. You know, it's just the nature of our society is a little different than theirs.
You do want to work hard.
Well, that too. So the challenge today sort of is, since, and I'll get into craft shows a little bit, but craft shows really have changed a huge amount from the 70s till today. And the new challenge is, how do you really connect with handmade work in a world where people oftentimes aren't even seeing it? I mean, you know, the internet has just changed things dramatically. And how do you make a personal connection with people and with them seeing and understanding your work? And that's a big challenge for us. We have an extensive website. It's becoming more and more a part of what I do, and I'll get into what's in the room and how that's all changed for us. But that's the real big challenge today, is how do you make connections with people? Because it's just product to most people. You know, they can buy 2 bowls that look almost identical, and one's handmade, and one comes from China, and the China one's lighter and a quarter the cost. Why not, you know? So there has to be something else going on, and that's something we're always sort of working toward. And I just kind of wrap up sort of my view of what's happened with the craft movement, and specifically potters, since that's always been my bent, is most of the really successful potters that I know, the people who actually, you know, pay all their taxes and put their kids through college and do all the things that normal human beings do, have more or less set up kind of, I wouldn't say, I hate to say factories, but they've made their money off of the labor of more people. Because one person trying to be the bookkeeper, the designer, the packer, the shipper, the marketer, and everything else leaves you almost no time to actually make the work itself. And the last thing I kind of make a comment on is most of the potters I know today, and I do a potluck dinner. We were just talking about this. I do a potluck dinner at my house every year. This was this would have been the 36th year, I think. We skipped it this year, but I invite all the potters that I know of in Vermont, whether they're doing it full time or just advocationists, and I invite about 420. Now, out of that, probably on 2 hands I can name all the ones who only make their income from the sale of their own work without another job or a spouse or something else going on. So it's not that easy a way to make a living, but it's an interesting trip. So me, I went to UVM. I worked on dairy farms growing up. I went to UVM Ag School in 1968. George Gatchard, who, if you know George Gatchard, he was my first teacher in 1969. He left the state, went to California for a few years, and Hideo Kino was there for another year and a half, and I worked under Hideo. Very different mindsets. George is that practical, almost farmer kind of potter. You know, you fix the machine yourself, you figure out a way to make things work, you do things as efficiently as you can and make a buck at it. Hideo was in, step back from the work and think about it. And both views are really wonderful to have merged together, but that was sort of the beginning of my career. And the only reason I sort of got into pottery was I was flunking out in '69, the year after TET, for those of us who remember TET. And I didn't really want to go to Southeast Asia. So somebody said, take a pottery course, you're going to get an A. And I did. I took the 2 semesters of ceramics. I got 2 A's. I stayed in college, and my dad didn't own a farm, so this was the next best thing for me to do, working with my hands, working outside, figuring out a way to make a living. And I started a pottery before I graduated college, because I kind of arranged, college is kind of like a game, I found out. You know, I was flunking out. I had like a 1.3 average my first year. I graduated my senior year, going to graduation. And again, you can imagine the times, we had a joint before we went to graduation. And I go to a graduation party, or to the graduation thing, and we'll have our caps and gowns on, and somebody hands me a thing that says, R. Compton CL, and I'm going, where's row CL? And the guy, it means cum laude, and I go, what's cum laude mean? It's like, I kind of got through college on the skin of my teeth, but in the 60s you could sort of do that. But in 1971 I opened a pottery in Irisville, Vermont, which is between Waitsfield and Moortown, and rented there for about a year, moved to Moortown itself for a year to consolidate, and that was my first outdoor pottery stand. And it was something I left out day and night. People had a honesty pot. People would take pots, leave money, and never got ripped off the whole time the stand was there. I'm like 3 feet off the road, and the house is like 5 feet off the road. It's right in if you know Moortown at all, it's tucked between the river and the road. And that was my very, very first pottery in 72. In 73, I bought a dilapidated farm property. It was only down to 2 acres, a collapsed barn and a farmhouse that was in bad shape. And the first year I was there, I was making pots, but I was finding most of my time was patching holes and trying to keep the house from freezing. I had eggs freeze on the kitchen table a couple of times. So you got to get the house a little warmer than that. That was my studio before we did additions to it. I put 14 additions on the buildings since I've been there over the years. I'm not going to go through that whole thing here, but it's just been, anytime I had an extra couple $100, that was a couple hundred more 2x4s. You could put another wing on and things expanded from there. So that barn got tar papered over. You'll see there's a silo foundation there to the left, which if you've ever driven down 116, you see a 3-story tower. That's my packing peanut tower, because we store styrofoam peanuts for shipping in there. And for about 10 years, we shipped everything we made. So that was the early stages. That was in 74, before we'd done very much work. I have a kiln inside that building, and in the summertime, I just set up, not unlike that, I set up a craft fair display. But I was looking for some other way to make a living than selling mugs and bowls, because everybody sells mugs and bowls. And if you go to a craft fair and there's 20 people there who are just trying to hope to get their costs back out of it, and you're trying to feed yourself, that's a hard one to work with. So I did make dinnerware, and actually there's some 1973 dinnerware sitting there on the table. But I tried a bunch of different stuff. I did footstools, I did mirrored, I did candelabras, did mirrored wall lights. Chris, my wife, is sitting on some footstools and end tables I had done. And just a quick side story, when we decided to set up this 1970s booth, because we thought everything in there is from the 70s, it would be kind of cute to have it be that era, I didn't have any mirrored wall lights, and I was burying my shard pile. And I've been in business for 40 years in almost the same place, and I have literally tons and tons and tons of broken pottery. And I had a tractor, and I was pushing some dirt over the pottery just to bury it. I saw this thing sticking up out of the ground. It was half moon, and it's the mirrored wall light that you see on the left, because I didn't own a mirrored wall light. And I pulled it out of the ground, and it wasn't bad. It had chipped when I made it, and I threw it away because I couldn't sell a chipped one, but now I decided to pull it out of the ground and clean it up, put a mirror light. I mean, it took me a day to clean it up. It was just been sitting in the ground for 20 years. So I put a light, and it didn't have the best pattern that like this one does. That's a much larger one that's in the photograph, but it was interesting. And I went over to David Epstein. Anybody knows David Epstein? He's a jeweler, good friend of ours. And I mean, I've known David forever, and we, traded and done all kinds of things. And I said, David, I dug this thing out of the ground. I've got a mirrored wall light. And he said, there's one in my basement which had stained glass in it. And I got that the day before the show. I went in his basement and pulled that one out. I was like, well, that's kind of cool. So a lot of the stuff is borrowed. The big Hanging Aquariums from Pat and Dave Sharp, who were friends of ours, and other pieces I had to borrow back just to kind of fill in that decade. So that's what those kind of architectural lighting things, related to. It was never very successful. I did a lot of things that didn't work, and you learn as much from the stuff that doesn't work as the stuff that does work. But I was making a lot of cover jars in the early 70s, and typical of the photography of the time, outdoors in the snow with trees, and now everything's seamless backdrops, and the world has changed with photography too. But what kind of frustrated me about those pieces was you couldn't see what was inside of them, and I just had this interest of wanting to see what was inside the cover jars. And at the time when we were doing the craft shows, a lot of people were writing, sage, pepper, marjoram, or whatever on the outside. I decided to put glass portholes in the sides of the cover jar. So I flattened a little area and put a little glass porthole in it, and that kind of led to the idea of making aquariums. That's the very first aquarium. It's a terrible photograph, but that hanging aquarium with the 2 big loops on the side of it was the first one I made in 1973, and that was at the Stowe Craft Fair. But that was sort of an indication to me that there was other things to make besides just pots that you could actually probably make a living off of, and that took me from just making dinnerware and doing a lot of hanging planters, which any potter from the 70s did, to starting to make aquariums. So I came up with the winning idea of doing the hanging aquariums, or doing stoneware aquariums, and I did a whole variety of them in sizes and in shapes and designs that worked and designs that didn't work, and they kind of evolved into like multi-ones, tanks, kind of condo fish tanks. This one we actually sold 2 of these to optometrists. I mean, it makes sense to me now. At the time, I didn't get it, but it was kind of an interesting thing to have dealt with. And the largest ones I ended up doing, which were 15 gallons, they would stand about this high, and you literally can't reach the bottom with your arm. So even though they're kind of cool objects, they were a real bitch to kind of clean, because you had to use tools to get in to work on them. These little 5-gallon ones, like the one on the left that's white that came out of our house, is the thing that we did the most of. And I designed those around UPS boxes, actually. So getting started out, I was lucky because I'd already started a business before I graduated college. In June of 1972, I graduated in May. June of 1972, I went to the Bennington Craft Fair. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the whole American craft movement, the American Craft Council was, it in this country. The American Craft Council didn't have any real shows, but they started here in Vermont in the early 60s. And Peter's not here, but Peter, Chris, help me with him. Peter Wendland, if anybody knows Peter Wendland in Moncton, helped organize the very, very first American Craft Council shows. They started here in Vermont. They moved around. They were in Mount Snow. They went to Stowe, Vermont. Bennington was the last one that was held in Vermont, and then it moved to Bennington, or to Rhinebeck, New York, and then it became a mega show. And I was just lucky enough to be there at the right time. So classic of the times, barefoot, roping up hanging planters at the show. And the craft show sign you see there is the same craft show sign. I don't throw anything away. The same craft show sign you see there. So that's a 40-year-old craft show sign that's sat in my barn all these years. So I did a whole bunch of shows in basically the 70s as a way to make a living. The American Craft Council shows proliferated big time. Rhinebeck was the only one, but then promoters found out that this was something that was successful for promoters as well as craftspeople, and they only accepted like 200 craftspeople at the American Craft Council shows. And the first couple of years I did those shows, and this is not bragging, it's just reality, I would go to a show and make an entire year's worth of income. I mean, in 1972, I do $20,000 in sales, which in today's dollars is a lot of money, at one show. And I didn't do anything else the rest of the year except fill orders and, shops that I had to turn away because I couldn't fill all their orders, to reconnect with. Well, the shows just proliferated. I mean, good things don't last long. And the American Craft Council ended up putting up like 10 different shows all over the country. Wendy Rosen, who's another promoter who tagged along with the American Craft Council shows. If they were doing a venue in Baltimore, she'd do a venue in Baltimore. So now you'd have 2 shows with about 2,000 craft exhibitors in them instead of 200, which was happening in the earlier days of the shows. I kind of saw an end to the shows. So we did other kind of things like tropical fish shows in Miami because I was doing aquariums. I wasn't kind of restricting myself to pots just because I was working in clay. But we did any kind of a venue that kind of made sense that was outside the craft world. So we did tropical plants for industry exhibition shows, which were people who bought plants for malls. We tried anything, half of which didn't work, believe me, half didn't work at all. I also used to do mall shows, which anybody remember mall shows, anybody of those? In the late 70s, there'll be, you could set up in the middle of a mall and they'd have all these craftspeople. I mean, this is really low tech. You'll be next to Tom McCann's shoes, trying to sell whatever it is you made. You're sleeping under your microbus in the parking lot of, some mall in New Jersey. It was like, it's a vagabond life. I knew I didn't want to do that forever. So the fountain business for me kind of faded away, lots of different reasons, one of which was they started being made in Mexico. And we were selling a lot in Texas and Arizona, and the people who were buying from us stopped buying from us, and happened to be on a trip down there, and we saw why. And I couldn't blame them. They were selling the aquariums that were made in Mexico. They didn't look that great, but they were selling them for less than I could buy the materials for. So, you know, if people have a choice between, back then the aquariums were $400, and they were selling them for like 95 retail. It's like, how do you argue with that, you know? So I moved on, I started doing water sculptures. And this kind of gives you a sense of a little growth period. The early ones were hand-thrown bowl forms. I throw a bowl, cut it diagonally with a wire, put a stem on it, and that's what you kind of see going on here on the left. They got a little bit more refined with the ones on the right. I changed my clay color. And then I had a back injury in '84 where I couldn't throw for a while. When I was doing that other work, I was throwing about 1,000 pounds of clay a day, and it just got to me from being bent over so much. And it wasn't just being bent over, it was all the other stuff you have to kind of deal with clay. So we went into casting. So from '85 until basically 1990, the forms became cast, and that was the evolution of the waterfalls, from thrown to a refined form to that one being a cast form, and then, you know, scaling them up to whatever height that happened to be a thrown one. And then working out other ideas for water sculptures. The Cascade, this was one actually I have to say I heavily borrowed from George Scatcherd. There's one of these in the Fleming Museum. They never have it out anymore, but it's a bowl form with little copper pipes sticking out so the water would drop through cleanly and neatly. The red fountain that you see here behind the screen, I kind of made little cow tits nipples instead of using copper, but the same kind of an idea of that. And that evolved into, you know, a little bit more refinement. And then eventually when I went into casting to save my back, they didn't have to be round anymore, because what comes out of a mold can be multi-shaped. So we started doing these kind of what we called a kind of cast, or a scallop petal, thank you, I forgot my own name here. Scallop petal design fountains. And at that time I had 2 people working for me, and that's like another whole life change. And that's what I was saying before. Most of the successful potters I know end up getting a crew of people who work for them, and they make money off of other people's labor. That's the nature of commercial, you know, free enterprise. If you're going to be a solo person like most of us are, we give a lot of that up. But for 3 years for 5 years I guess, I had 2 people who worked with us. They ended up making more than we did, which was a sign to us that we maybe shouldn't be doing this. And then the recession in '89 kind of really killed us. But I tried all kinds of other design concepts. Both this one that's on the wall and this other one, prototypes. I never went into production with them. They made them, they worked, but when you did all the cost analysis on what it costs to have a carpenter make the form and do all this and that, it became unviable. So sometimes you'll work through 20 or 30 forms before you find one that's worth kind of pursuing. This is the funniest one of all. Susan Cuna, who was working for us and could draw. I mean, if you ask me to draw, it's a round head with 2 dots and a smiley face, because my ability to draw was minimal. But Susan, who went to Philadelphia College of Art, along with my wife actually, I had her draw up some concepts, and this health club in Boston approached us and said, would you do a fountain for our health club? And I said, well, I don't really like to do custom pieces, because, you know, what's in your head and what we do doesn't ever seem to work out. And, you know, we finally did up a whole bunch of designs. I'm only showing you this one because that's more or less the design we did for them. You know, we did this in whatever the year, 1990. Finished the whole project. It was an $18,000 piece. They paid us for it. They never set it up. They closed the health club. They moved on to other things. I have no idea whatever happened to it. So I never got a photograph of it set up, but we got paid for it. But it kind of puts you in the headset that there's more worlds than we as kind of struggling craftspeople live in. And they were very nice people, but it would kind of surprise me we never got a chance to see it. So staying with the whole fountain theme, that after the aquariums, fountains became the mainstay, we had to figure out how to ship things. So on the silo foundation you saw in an earlier shot, I built a 3-story tower, and that chute here feeds peanuts down into our shipping area. We would sometimes fill up 2 UPS trucks in a day with boxes, because every one of these fountains like this you think you're getting a sofa when it arrived. You know, we pack them so well, and we never ever had breakage. I mean, we shipped to Saudi Arabia, we shipped to Japan was our best market for a couple of years. We just never had breakage, but you had to really overpack to do that. And that was it. So hanging out of that chute, or this kind of endless supply of peanuts that would come out in boxes, we'd inner box each piece, float them in that. The bigger pieces that were too big for UPS, we'd inner box, put them on pallets, strap them up, and then, you know, not having a forklift or anything else, we'd get our heavy set friends to come over and slide them on the back of the truck and get them to a common carrier where they'd actually had a forklift to take these things off from. But I tend not to do the big pots for preference. They're just too hard to move around. So about 1985, soon after we'd gone into casting, I'd lost interest in being the vagabond going to craft shows and, I mean, sleeping under the microbus and having the campfire and playing the dulcimers. And it was a lot of fun, but you get old for that too. So we had to figure out some other way to make this whole thing work. And what I did in 85 was Christine and I made a tour of the country going to the World Trade Centers, and we found agents, like musicians have agents that find you gigs. We found art agents who would find stores to sell our water sculptures to. I was pretty much just down to making aquariums and fountains, so it was only kind of two products that we had to deal that with, and that's what happened. And these agents would bring us in about 40 or 50 new stores every year. Now, the attrition, excuse me, but the attrition rate for little stores, whether they're craft stores or anything else, is 3 years. So if you're in the business, you've got to realize that I always thought if I could get 10 good galleries, I could live. But when you put this attrition thing on it, every 3 years, you know, a store is going to be gone. You know, in 9 years, you would have no stores. So you're always out looking for shops. And that's what the agents did for us. They were able to bring us in 30 or 40 new stores a year. We'd lose 10 or 15 from the other ones, and it kind of kept moving us along over a period of years. And we were also putting out a catalog that we advertised in magazines for. So that was sort of the gist of this period of my life. The 70s was that. The 80s was really concentrated on the water sculptures. We had a 16-page color catalog. You got to remember, this predates the internet, so everything was done with postage and mailing, and running ads in gardening magazines was to hopefully get them to ask for your catalog, which, you know, was a lot of effort for us both to produce and send out. And then the recession in '89, which a lot of people kind of probably didn't even know existed, really hit a lot of us big time. We had like 60% of our stores just disappeared, and we had to kind of figure out what are we going to do for a living. We actually talked about getting real jobs, but that was like a short talk. You know, that wasn't going to happen too much for us. So we had to figure out a new way of making a living. And what we did is in '92, we opened a showroom at our studio. We weren't open to the public from '73 when I moved to Bristol until 1992. We just didn't have a sign up because of what we were making. And so we opened a showroom. I didn't have any pots, so I started making bowls and mugs for the first time in 20 years. And I made some stuff that is not in the show because I don't want anybody to see it. And it was pretty awful stuff. It was beginner pottery because I was having to kind of relearn the whole process again. So it was a real time of transition for me. And I needed to figure out something else because I'd been making aquariums and fountains, most of which were unglazed. Some of them had to do with texture. They were hand-beaten textures on those, or scraped textures on these. But I had to figure out some other way of coming up with something that I could make a mark on without being a decorator. So I built a bunch of different kilns. Bob Green, who was a potter around here, introduced me to Raku Firings in 1991, and I built 4 or 5 Raku kilns. That's a little Raku Car Kiln that I have, and I'm still using that Raku kiln. Raku and pit firing, which is over in the corner there, is about 5 to 10% of our business. It's a small amount, but it's visually always important to have people come in and see a variety of things. You know, they may always buy that one mug over there, but they like to see the other stuff, and if they didn't have the other stuff, the mug would never get sold. So So they're just variations of Raku. My Raku is pretty subtle, mostly just dealing with crackle glazes. And these were forms that once I went into, I'd injured my back and I went into slip casting in these forms. I worked up a few other ideas. The two that we sort of do the most of were these clocks, but we did lamps and a lot of other forms that, again, weren't very successful. So a quick thing that we were kind of learning as we went along, I was building up infrastructure. I built a wood kiln, which is behind all these folks. I built a pit kiln. I built 2 Raku kilns. I had like 7 kilns at my place at one point in time, and I decided there's another way of making a living at this. I'll give workshops. So we started giving workshops at our studio, and we'd have 5 to 10 people come for like 2 days and do something intensive. Raku firing if they'd never done it, or wood firing if they'd never done it. We had to have a small wood kiln to fire that fast, but we figured it out. And we did a fair amount of pit firing because, again, it's just, you know, colorful, and people like color. And it's really not a hard technique to do. I mean, it's a very primitive technique to do, and I'm planning on doing a lot more of it now that I put my head together going, wow, this is pretty cheap to make, and you can sell it for a fair amount of money. So the work I like the most is the work that is hardest for a lot of people to understand and is hardest to actually produce, which is the wood-fired and salt glazed. But I will continue to produce a certain amount of pit-fired work. So the changes that occurred for me during the 1990s, we kind of broke this whole exhibit into the 70s, 80s, 90s, was, you know, transitioning over from the water sculpture business to something else. And I didn't know what the something else was, but it was a matter of like trying firing techniques, Raku pit firing, and also just trying out different kinds of forms. But I also sort of needed to expose myself to other people's work because I was a little insulator where I was. So we started giving workshops. And any potter that I know who makes their living as a potter can't afford to travel. I mean, that's just the reality of it. But if you can get workshops overseas, you can kind of work that whole thing out. So over a period of about 6 years, I gave 40 workshops in Australia, New Zealand, England, Wales, Ireland, Canada. And it gave me, we didn't make a lot of money at the process. If we could break even on a trip, that was great. But the main thing was we just met so many potters. And traveling around the country and knocking on potters' doors, which we do anyway. I mean, anytime we drive to a town and see a pot sign, we pull in and at least take a quick look to see what's going on there. But going to these workshops where you have 10 or 20 people, half of which are making their living at it, you really can pick up a lot of information that way. So this was England and North Wales and Derry, Northern Ireland, and Auckland, New Zealand. But we did it over a period of like 5 different trips. We did those kind of things. And I started doing workshops at my studio after that, which became, for about 14 years, we gave about 5 workshops every summer at our place in Bristol. Because again, we had built the infrastructure up anyway. So one of them was on throwing large pots, which is really more like a magic trick than to be oohed and awed at. It's just a matter of learning how to dry the clay as you pull up more of it so it can support the weight. It's not a muscle thing. Although and I don't have this here, the next workshop, the next talk I do is about process, and I'll talk about that. But I didn't know how to make big aquariums, and I made aquariums twice the size of that hanging one, where I start out with 110 pounds of clay, and I just threw it. I didn't know that you didn't throw 110 pounds of clay at a time. And I was young enough and strong enough that I could actually pull it off. Not anymore. But I learned the techniques that really were done, where you throw a portion of the pot, dry it so it could support the weight, add a coil of clay. Maybe we have some shots of it later, shots later on, and you throw the coils up. So you kind of build the pieces up in sections. So this was a firing workshop we gave at our studio in the probably early 2000s. And yeah, there you go. And so the bigger pots were made in that kind of a context. They're not really coil built, but you throw the form. What I'm putting that thick coil on is only the thickness of your finger. And then I just work the edges in and then throw that up and then just kind of finish off the forms that way. I usually would have 3 wheels going at once, so I could have all 3 started and then to have a torch I'd put on them and dry them, and by the time one of them is cool enough to touch again, I'd add a coil to that and work that up and and worked my way through it. So at the end of the day, you could produce, maybe 3 pots that were like yay big. And you weren't really killing yourself. It was a lot easier in a lot of respects than being bent over a wheel and throwing bowls. But mainly the kind of 1992 to 2002 period for me was just trying to figure out something new. I took workshops with a few other potters. Ellen Shanken, if anybody knows who Ellen Shanken is, and Randy Johnston was another one, Bob Green. But these were like 2-day workshops. It wasn't that I didn't know how to throw, but you just want to see the little techniques that people use that make their work differently, and tools they use. I mean, some of these like bizarre tools like shore-form blades that you use for wood rasping. You go, whoa, this is a cool tool to use in clay. I mean, that's essentially how the outside of this whole shape piece was done. It was shaved down. So rather than just being a potter and throwing pots all day, you throw a pot and you let it dry, and then it's kind of like rubbing Buddha's belly. You just scrape the pot for hours on end, and it's kind of therapeutic to kind of have that ability to do different types of interaction with clay. So again, altering forms became more of what I did. So everything wasn't just left round. I worked out, different types of texturing devices, wire cuts with basically cheese cutters. Just any tools I picked up as part of the travel was just really, really helpful for me. So as in anything else, I've developed a whole variety of new lines of work, of which, I won't even tell you which ones they are, but there's like 5 that we sell all the time. And then all these other ones I keep making, and they keep getting better and better ones of, but they aren't the most popular ones. These are the 2 things we sell by far the most of. Batter bowls and colanders. I mean, everybody sees them. You'll see them at the farmer's market. You're going to see them at every store. And there's logic to it. They're very functional. There are price points there. So we do those, but I fire those in gas. And I'll say, I haven't talked about wood and salt very much yet, but gas firing really produces a pretty consistent result. And for those of you who aren't potters, I'll just kind of give you a little step back on process. More and more potters have gone to electric kilns, and there's really good reasons for it. You have consistent temperature, radiant heat coming from all directions, nothing burning, so there's no fuel being consumed, which means there's the same kind of oxygen content in there. So if you're going to do imagery, if you're going to paint flowers and do landscapes or whatever, it's going to come out pretty much what you expect it to be because the atmosphere is so steady. You move into gas-fired kilns and you have incomplete combustion, basically carbon monoxide is floating around in the kiln looking for oxygen. It seeks it out of the metals that are in the clay and the glazes, and you get like spotty pots. Like my mugs that are those little white cups over there have these big brown burnout marks because there was iron in the clay and it burned out because the oxygen got pulled out of the iron. Classic 60s look, that iron burnout, if anybody remembers the 60s look. But that's why people would go to gas firing because it gave a little more interest to it. I've now moved on to wood firing and salt glazing, which gets more and more bizarre from a standpoint of going, does this make any business logic? But at some point in your life, you gotta, if you want to do it, you got to do it. I mean, you can't wait until you're 80 to start because you won't get very far. So we opened a showroom in 2001. We still had fountains, and that was Sheena, who we just lost this summer, but she was our greeter, and she loved to drink out of the fountains. That was her thing, and boy, customers love to see that. I mean, I can't tell you how many customers have gone home with photographs of this dog drinking out of our fountain. And this was a showroom that was in the basement of our house for 20 years. If you haven't been to our studio in the past 2 years, I've been primarily being a carpenter at our studio, fixing up all the things that I did badly 25 years ago. And we moved the showroom out of our house into the studio. So I've lost a little studio space, but we have now reclaimed this is the showroom that was underneath our house. That is now my wife Christine's weaving studio. So the last decade, which is, and all this stuff really overlapped. I made aquariums after 1982, and I made fountains after 1992. But the reality sort of has, the focus really majorly changed, and the drift over kind of occurred. But in around 1988, 1989, I started doing those pots right in the back there that are salt glazed. And the pots over here are salt glazed. They were some of the earlier ones I did, and I liked the forms on them. Spent way too much time making them, realizing you can't sell them at a price that anybody wants to buy them at. But it got me involved in the surface quality of what I wanted to look for in my work. And that meant building kilns that would fire in a way that the surface became the decoration rather than a paintbrush. And so today I still do gas production work, which are like these batter bowls that are underneath the table. A little more inconspicuous, but they're there to be sold. And I just basically started working with, trying to develop new kinds of forms. Wood ash firing, if you're not familiar with it, these pots had no glaze on them, but the fly ash coming in on the flames of the kiln have trace minerals in it, which act as a flux. And when it hits the pot, it can actually interact with the silica in the clay and start to form a glaze. So a pot like this was probably sitting between two pots here and here, which protected it, and the ash went through and landed on there. So you get these patterns that are not obvious to non-potters or collectors. I mean, I love collectors, not so much because they buy great pots, and they do, which is great, but because they know pots, and they come in and they look at the pieces and they can appreciate the little subtleties. Like, they'll go and they go, hare's fur, wow, you know what hare's fur is? I mean, there's one big bowl here. We'd put like a $900 price tag on it, and I go, I can't sell it. I can't do it. We put an offer sale on it. Just because the hare's fur on that was something I'll get 1 out of 50 in a firing, and I can sell the other ones for, enough to make up for owning that one. So I'm keeping more and more a small body of my own work, just because it's I call it flushing it through the system, but just because it's a 12-inch bowl doesn't mean it has to be $80 because all the other 12-inch bowls are. I'm starting to put those aside now for exhibitions like this one was. A lot of stuff isn't for sale in here, unfortunately, from a standpoint of making money, but it does show a pattern of what I consider to be the more interesting kinds of work. So. Wad marks, if you're not familiar with salt glazing, I know there's potters here are, but when you're salt glazing, you're basically throwing sodium in the kiln, which vaporizes, becomes a flux in the fire. It's called vapor glazing. The flames in the kiln have sodium in it. When it hits the clay pot, it literally eats away the clay and forms a glaze. German beer steins are the classic example. Blue German or gray German beer steins, bumpy texture. That's salt glazing. The trouble with salt glazing is it eats away silica that is in anything. And the whole kiln's made out of silica, it's bricks. The kiln shelves the pots sit on are made out of silicon carbide. So you eat away your whole kiln. On my third salt kiln, they lasted me 60 firings, and I had to tear them down and start all over again. And I know other potters get by with a lot more firings, but I go for the heavy salt look. I mean, if you put 3 pounds of salt in, you get a certain look, a salt glazing look. Like the Eskimos have 20 names for snow, wet snow, cold snow, dry snow, big snow. Salt glazing is the same way. There's orange peel, there's onion skin, there's all these different textures you get from salt glazing. And I go for the orange peel, heavy orange peel. So I'm putting 125 pounds of salt in the kiln, and it just eats the bricks up like crazy. So I built a larger kiln now, so I won't fire as often. So 70 firings, I've now calculated I'll be 101 by the time I get done 70 firings. So we only fire once or twice a year, so that's the reason for the really big kiln that we have now. This is real heavy orange peel. The other one is another variation of salt glazing. These are called pilgrim flasks. These are a piece that I've kind of gotten, I don't want to say reputation for, but they become kind of a signature piece of mine. Why more people don't do them, I don't know. I'm happy they don't actually, but historically they were canteens. They were drinking vessels. Everybody thinks of them as being a teapot, but they were something pilgrims would carry as a canteen, a flask to drink out of. I just love the forms. And if you look in history books, there is no one form. Like there's no one form of any canteen. But that's one of the pieces I really like making the most. I've also studied a bit, not having gone to Japan, but I have lots of books. I have a library of hundreds of pottery books. And now that the internet exists, pottery books are they're all relevant. You can find so much online. But Jomon is something that's becoming a bigger and bigger part of my work. Jomon means cord pressed. It's a style of pottery that dates from about 8,000 BC to about 800 BC in Japan. And that culture had a textiled surface on most of the work they did. I'm really bastardizing the history of this, but the point really comes across that Jomon is that kind of a pattern you get. And by having an incised pattern, when you're doing salt glazing and wood firing, and especially Celadon glazes, the glaze will lay in the valleys where it's an indentation. The glass is thicker there, so whatever oxide is in the glaze, especially the Celadon, you will get a darker color. So you end up getting these patterns that are not something that you did as a potter, you just created the circumstances for it. There's a number of Ming Dynasty bowls that have been done that are beautifully carved. I mean, you know, winged dragons and pagodas, and people go, these are just beautiful, beautiful paintings that were done on these Ming Dynasty vases. They weren't paintings at all, they were carvings. They were carved into the porcelain. Celadon glaze was put over them. The deeper the carving, the deeper the color, and they read as paintings. And when you put your hand over the outside, you can't feel any of the texture. But they're just, to me, they're just some of the most amazing pots made. I'm more the rough and tumble kind of guy, so I go for the rougher surfaces. So yeah, so that's what I was saying before. The logic kind of gives way to my personal interest. If I was really thinking only in terms of business, I wouldn't have built a wood kiln in my 50s and be firing it now. There's a much smaller audience when you get into this work that's a little more esoteric. You have to know more about it to understand why it has a greater value. And you know, it's something I've kind of decided if I'm ever going to do it, I got to do it now, and that's where I am. So we built this kiln. If you've been to our studio, you've seen it. It's a large Noburagama. Chambers are about 7 feet high inside, 7 feet deep, 7 feet wide. Burns about 6 cords of wood, and now we're firing for 60 hours. Generally, we were soaking it about every 6 to 8 minutes. The last firing, I was having a lot of trouble. In fact, I was having no luck finding people to stay up all night. So I did a couple 40-hour straights, and it doesn't work. I mean, it works, but it's really tiring. So I figured out a way to fire for like a day, bank the kiln, go to bed, get up in the morning, get it going again. The second day actually be able to fire off the first chamber, get it up to a temperature, hold the temperature long enough that I feel the glazes are done. The salt chamber, the back chamber, will have reached about 2,000 degrees. I'll just clam everything up, and then the next day the salt chamber will drop to about 1,500 in the morning, and I can fire that off. So I'm actually able to get sleep now, which is a big deal when you're firing, because about the time you want to make the decisions of should we stop the firing now, you're so punch drunk, you're going, yeah, let's stop it. Anything, let's just get this thing over with. And I've stopped way too many firings that were a little bit under fired. So these are more variations of what's going on in the work of the wood and salt chambers. That pot is actually, on the right, is actually a Korean Celadon glaze that was done in the wood chamber. And just so people understand it, and I put that pot there because you can see the chop on the lower right of it. A chop basically is like a trademark. In England, the trademarks often tend to be initials, like you'd have like a JW, Josiah Wedgwood, would be the stamp, the potter's chop there. And actually, if you're really buying the commercial ware from places like Josiah Wedgwood, there would be 2 or 3 other marks. The mark of the person who glazed the pot, the mark of the person who fired the pot even. So there's sometimes 2 and 3 marks on those pots. And actually, this is a story I love to tell, so I'll throw it out again. But a lot of people don't understand what bone china is. People know what bone china is. But porcelain, which is what was being made in China, which is this very pure form of clay, kaolin, is fired to a very high temperature with the glazes at the same temperature, roughly around 24, 2500 degrees. And when you get to that temperature, the glaze and the clay body have an interface where the glaze actually penetrates into the clay and it wants to start to sag. I mean, the pots are just on the verge of becoming glass. But that's really what makes the porcelain pieces that were the big trade item after the spice trade with Europe extremely valuable. And the demand for porcelain in Europe during that 1600 period was immense in terms of, I mean, there were times when porcelain pieces were valued the same weight as gold. I mean, this is nuts, it's clay. But Europeans didn't know how to make this stuff. And I'm going to, again, stretch the story a little bit, but people like Josiah Wedgwood, and there was a Frenchman who I can't remember his name from, had figured out a technique where they could add calcium to the clay, a white clay that was very much like porcelain, that would flux it so it would fire to a lower temperature. And they would then fire that pot to a low temperature without a glaze on it, and they could put the pot like a tea bowl, they could put it on its rim, so when they fired it, it would not warp, because when it's just in the air, the flames kind of want to twist the piece. So they fire them without a glaze on them on the rims, and then they would fire it a second time with a low fire glaze, so they wouldn't warp the pot because it wouldn't get that hot, and they get this really beautiful pottery out that looks almost identical to bone china or to porcelain, but it was fired in an entirely different way. And the flux they used to make the glaze melt at a low temperature was lead. So like bone china, generally speaking, is lead glazed pottery, which is what Mexicans used because it's a cheap flux to make the firing temperatures go at a very low temperature. It's not a big deal to worry about. Everybody worries about if they eat bone china, they're going to kill themselves now. And since the 70s, you can't get it in this country anyway. But the reason it's called bone china was they ground up ox bones, and that was a calcium source that they used to make bone china with. Anyway, it's a little story that I always think is kind of cool because everybody comes in talking about their bone china that their grandmother gave them. And what it is fake porcelain with a bunch of decals on it. And as a potter, I go, yeah, pretty decals. So I don't say that to them, but but to me, it's like, it just doesn't have the same pizzazz. So this is the sort of the more current work I've been doing, trying out different forms, doing carving a bit on forms. Again, the pot on the right gives a little bit of a sense of what we call windward leeward. The salt was hitting this side of the pot more, so you get more of a buildup, and then you can kind of see in the backside in the flame shadow, it's a quieter look. So you oftentimes, when you pick up wood-fired or particularly salt glazed pots, there's a variegation from one side to the other. Industry hates this. It's what I'm looking to do. I'm always disappointed when the pots come out really evenly salted, and I put those other ones aside as special pieces. The pot on the left was again, more experimental work for me, but I'm putting wads on the pot, firing the pot on the side, and we're getting what they call comet trails, where the flames are going around the wad marks. This pot was sitting on the side, and they kind of create these patterns of ash going around the pieces. And I'm just going to finish off this whole thing with kilns, because kilns now have become, and people who've known me a long time kind of know that I can't seem to resist building kilns. I built probably 20 at my studio and torn down and built, and then I built this kind of monster thing. And I still got a beehive stuck in my head that I want to build, a dome one before it's all over. But they're kind of an integral part of what I do. So my studio now has a bigger building behind it, which is where the big wood kiln is. This car kiln has been retired in '07, but I now have a new car kiln in the place of it. I have a small salt glazed and or wood-fired or gas-fired salt kiln just up the hill from the big kiln. This is a test kiln for me. Before I fire the big kiln, I always want to make sure my glazes have been mixed right, and I didn't do something stupid like put them on too thick or too thin. And I'll just go through 3 or 4 shots of building the big kiln, which turned out to be a little bigger project than I expected. I was kind of used to building a kiln in like a week, because they, they're just bricks laid up. It's not that big a deal. But when you get to this scale, it all kind of changed. And like building the wooden forms that held the arch up, that when you were putting them together, and then when all the chambers were done, I kind of parged over them with cement. I even put arches over the doors, which were totally aesthetic. You didn't need them. You could use the top of the kiln for the arch, but you got that close, in for a pound, in for a penny, and we went for the whole thing. Built a chimney on the outside of it. I think this is one of our first firings. Chris and I have it already unloaded. I take part of the roof off when I'm firing to let smoke out of the building, and of course the chimney gives you these long trails of flames and smoke. And fire sort of is, I guess I'm more of a fire potter now than I've ever been. When I was doing water sculptures, it didn't matter. Fire was just a way to get the things hard. Now fire is more of what, it determines what my pots are looking like. And I won't get into, I'm doing a kiln building workshop in 3 weeks, or a class in 3 weeks, which I'll ramble on way too much about. But I built this for a lot of ergonomic reasons. I didn't want to bend over when I stoked, so the stoke holes were high. I didn't want to bend over when I built the kilns, so the chambers were high. So that's one of the last firings we did. And Tom Pollock's not here, is he? No. Tom took that photograph, which was a real good shot. So that is sort of it. That was just an hour too, huh?
That was good. Does anyone have any questions for Robert? Oh, so
What's next?
Pardon?
What's next?
What's next? Actually, spending more time on each pot. I spent my life sort of, how fast can I, it's not greedy, but how fast can I make a piece, get it through the process and fire it and sell it at a reasonable price. And I'm just getting to an age right now where I'm going to put more time in on pots. I mean, they may or may not become really sellable, but I'm going to do them anyway. At least a portion of my work is going to be that way. I'd never mind doing production work. I mean, I was one of those guys who never minded, picking up a shovel and digging a ditch 30 feet long, 4 foot deep. So making pots sort of falls in that same category, except the body doesn't like it so much anymore.
Bob, when you went through your slip casting,
I skipped over that because next week I'm going to talk about process.
Okay.
I mean,
were you doing your own
molds? Well, when I injured my back, I was really in a jam. I mean, it was like, that's when we talked about like, let's figure out some other way of making a living. And I went up to Quebec, and Michelle and Sarah know, I'm blanking on his name now. James Ewing. James Ewing was a mold maker, just across the border in Fredericksburg. He's really close. He's like 2 hours away. And I took up models of the early pieces for him, and he produced, those forms. I mean, I threw them on the wheel, made sure they worked, because when you're hand throwing forms, especially like the one on the far right was one of the first handmade ones. Actually, that was Christine, my wife's parents. When they died, we got that back. So that's a 1976 fountain, and I made them all by hand. And I'd throw like a 10-pound bowl, a 20-pound bowl, a 30-pound bowl, 40-pound bowl. We cut them diagonally, hand shape them, and then the water would splatter all over the place because you never got all the angles, just right on it. When I went into mold making, I knew that it was really critical to get these just right, because once you did it, you would never have to do it again. So I spent more time making the model for that than I ever did doing anything, and he made the molds for it. But I might as well have gone into bronze casting. The similarity between being potters like we are, where you make things with clay, and pouring liquid into a negative is really different.
in the back?
Yeah, I'm just curious, how big was the salt kiln, or is the salt kiln that you put 25 pounds in?
Oh, how big's the big kiln I'm putting 120 pounds in?
Oh, the wood kiln? Oh, I thought you had.
Well, actually, the kiln that is, actually I can go up to it real quick here because it's not that far up. Was it? Oh, there it is. Okay. On the far right is a firebox. Where Chris and I are standing is the traditional glazing chamber. If you know what I mean by that, I'm basically doing like Tomoko, Chinos, Celadon glazes. And then the back chamber, which I call a slave chamber, but it's also my salt chamber. That chamber is where I'm adding salt to. The inside dimensions of the chamber are basically 7 by 7 by 7. So what does that work out to be? I don't know. Big. You know, I kind of like to figure a pound of salt per cubic foot. You know, so I figured I had, and I'm not counting the firebox area or the bag walls. So I figured I probably had about 150 feet or 200 feet of loading space in there, and it's been fired enough now that, you know, it takes less salt the more you fire, as you know. You know, the bricks get saturated. But having said that, the last time I fired, I started having alligator skin. Any potters who were salt firing potters here, I started having alligator skin on the bricks, and they started flaking. That was not fun. That was like all the stuff falling down on the pots. The top shelves were getting really. So I had to grind the whole inside wall of the kiln off with a diamond grinder, get it down to bare brick, and we're starting again.
What are the pros and cons of having an agent, and what percentage do they usually take?
A remark from a real potter here. When I was doing craft shows I'll do real quick demise. Craft shows were really incredible in the early 70s. I mean, it was a party. But I realized by the mid 80s that, you know, things were changing. There was more and more shows, more and more competition for them, and it didn't seem like there was more and more buyers coming to them. So when we did the calculations of how much it was costing us to do shows, and basically for those of you who are sort of familiar how most things work, if you have $100, we'll do a $100 piece to make it easy. If you have a $100 piece and you sell it to a store, the store buys it for you for $50. That's keystone. That's pretty normal. And you work out the deal with packing and shipping with them. Sometimes you pay some of the packing, sometimes they do, but you're going to get less than half of whatever the suggested retail price is. When we worked with agents, they got 20% of our cut. So a $100 pot, we get 30 for. So you really just had to be sure that they sold for enough that, you know, your 30% was viable. And you know, it really wasn't that much different than doing craft shows. Because you go to a craft show and you're going to get 50% from all these buyers you meet, but by the time you spend $2,000 on a booth fee, you stay in a hotel for 3 days at $150 a night, your car breaks down on the way and you have to have your head gasket replaced. And you know all the stuff that goes along with it. You could be out, you know, $5,000-6,000 just to get to the show and do the show, and you know you're giving the stores 50%. I'd rather give it to the agent, and you know I didn't have to spend anything, you know, until the sale goes through. But I think that's changed now, John. I'm not sure it all works the same. Internet has just changed the world, you know. I mean, you get this stuff online. And on, I didn't say this at all, and again, my next talk's sort of on business and on forming stuff, but the internet's becoming more and more important to us. I mean, we're actually selling pots on the internet. Not a lot, but I mean, we had a woman last month who bought, you know, $1,500 worth, not one pot, but she bought from us on 2 different occasions about $1,500 worth of work, all retail, never heard of us before, but just found us on the web. And the whole web thing is another whole world of having a web presence that isn't just a business card. If you've been to our website and you've had 3 days to look at it, you'll realize there's about 400 pages. A A lot of them are hidden, but it's a huge website. So we kind of, I wouldn't say we fake it out, but people actually think we know what we're doing when they read the whole website because of all this stuff. And they like to know that we sold to like George Harrison, the Beatles, and Baron von Hilton, and Hilton Hotels. They bought our work through galleries when we had them. And you throw those names out, not because, oh, I'm puffy, but it helps sell pots. I mean, just the reality is if people think people that they respect have bought your work, it makes it a lot easier for them to open their wallets up. So the whole idea of our website has been, give as much visual information as we can about process. So if they can understand what the process is, they can understand why, my jugs are $250. And I've seen some great jugs down in South Carolina in the Seagrove area for $40 and $50, and I wanted to go just buy them up and bring them up here and sell them in my shop. But they're different too. I mean, there's different aspects to why they are what they are.
So you may talk about this in one of your other points.
That's okay, I don't mind.
You touched a little bit on the pricing thing. It's really hard to know how to price something. Would you generally start at the bottom and start with your time and what you feel something's worth? Would you look at the market, somewhere in between? You've probably changed a bunch of times over the years. I mean,
yeah, it was easy when I had like the water sculpture business because the piece was the piece was the piece. It didn't vary. You didn't get a better aquarium or a worse aquarium. I mean, we had seconds, but I mean, they either came out good or they didn't. The trouble with the wood fired and the salt glazing to me is, I can put the big wood kiln, that kiln holds about 12 to 1,500 pieces, about 600 to 700 in each chamber. And that depends on how big the pots are, but roughly we get, we have a few big pots and then lots of Unomis and little things that go through that. But I don't think I'm exaggerating to say that it's like 1 out of 30 that come out like, ooh, I got it. One out of 30 isn't like the kind of numbers you really want to hit on. And with the batter bowls that we sell lots of, at $50 a piece, I get like a 95% success rate out of the kiln. So we probably net more on a $50 batter bowl than I do on a $260, Pilgrim that I salt glazed, where the salt glaze came out great on. That's a hard, and I hate to use the short answer of what the market will bear, but that's, and that's part of it. I have a friend, and I don't think I'm giving anything away, Phil Rogers, who's a Welsh potter. Probably nobody's ever heard of him here. But he sells a pucker gallery in Boston. And if you know pucker gallery is the gallery in the world of functional pottery, not Volcus artwork. And when we knew Phil in Ireland and in Wales before he came over here, and when he got picked up by Bernie, Phil and I had a conversation about the whole process, and he said, well, Bernie said to me, Bernie flew over to look his work over, and actually the short, long story was, Phil was doing workshops around the country to help put food on the table, so he'd travel here to give workshops. I was traveling to England to give workshops, and one of the people who took one of his workshops here knew Bernie Pucker, who's got this great gallery in Boston, and recommended to Bernie, you should go see Phil Rogers' work. So he flew over to Wales to meet Phil, and they talked about the whole process. And the gist of it was that he said, I want the best 15% of the work that you do. I mean, you're making 100 pots, I want that 1.5 or 10 that came out good. The rest of them, you don't even show them to me. That's what I want you to be sending over to me. And the price point of Phil's pots when they hit this country pretty much just had a zero added to the end of them. His $150 jugs were $1,500 jugs, and it wasn't necessarily unfair. I mean, it cost Bernie a lot to have this gallery on Newbury Street in Boston, and it costs a lot to fly pots over, and all that kind of goes into it. But Bernie can find the clientele that looks at pots from a collector standpoint rather than I'm going to go put my, my 3-year-old's milk in it and put it on the table, you know. So there's different avenues.
Well, I want to thank everyone for coming out tonight. This has been a great turnout. We're really pleased. Thank you very much. And thank you, Robert.
Oh yeah, thank you.
Thank you.